Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we are taking a look at a Chinese mystery Mauser. This is really something along the same sort of lines as the Warlord-era artisanal mystery pistols that were used by a whole bunch of Chinese warlord armies. Well, it wasn't limited to just pistols. They did the same thing with rifles. So the Chinese formal army, as well as a bunch of the Chinese warlord armies, made extensive use of Mauser pattern rifles, basically Mauser 98 pattern rifles, during the end of the Manchu dynasty and during the Warlord era, and frankly all the way through the Chinese Civil War. They bought guns from a bunch of different companies. They bought them from Mauser, they bought them from FN, they bought them from CZ, all over the place. And of course they used other patterns of rifle as well, but 98 Mausers were a large, one of the most common, most popular styles. And of course they started manufacturing Mauser 98 type rifles at least 3 different major Chinese arsenals. In fact, we also have a book, a reprint of the book called Arming the Dragon by Dolf Goldsmith, about the Chinese formal factory production Mauser pattern rifles. But what we have here is sort of the step down in quality, the artisanal knockoff of, specifically in this case, an FN Model 30 rifle. So if we're talking about FN specifically, between 1930 and 1934, FN sold something like 24,000 Model 24 rifles to various groups in China. They then followed that up with a much more significant series of orders between 1937 and 1939, where in fact China was one of FN's very best customers. They sold like 164,500 FN Model 30 Mauser pattern short rifles of this exact configuration to various armed groups in China. And so it should come as really no surprise that small Chinese shops, individual artisans, gunsmiths, would copy those FN pattern Mausers. They were recognized as a very well-made European weapon, something that soldiers were familiar with, well, everyone was familiar with, and well, that's the sort of thing that you want to make a copy of. So let's take a look at how this particular one managed to turn out. The pattern of Mauser that was most prevalent in China was one basically just like this. A short rifle standard, so you would have typically a 23.6-inch barrel. There's an upper handguard, which on some of these is half length, like this one. That would be the pattern for the FN Model 30. The FN Model 24s, which were much fewer in number, had a full-length handguard that came all the way out here. In fact, it's kind of interesting that this one has a front band that's made to accommodate a full-length handguard. You can see there's a bunch of space between the barrel and the nose cap out there, or the front band out there, so you could slide a wooden handguard under that. However, it doesn't have a full-length handguard on it. The FN-30s had straight bolts. Some of the various Mauser patterns that went into China had bent bolts, some had straight. You will also see a variety of sling attachments. This we have sling swivels on the bottom, but sometimes you'll find them on the sides with other different Mauser patterns. So how do you distinguish between a real FN and a fake artisanal production one? Well, in this case at least, it's pretty easy to do by the crest on top of the receiver. That is someone's attempt, and it's not a terrible attempt, but it's very obviously not an actual FN crest. What this ought to look like is that, which, I mean, once you've seen the real one, it's pretty easy to recognize the fake one like this. On a real FN Mauser, you will also have manufacturer information here on the side rail. You'll also have proof marks. We have none of that on this one, although it does have a serial number on it right there. A lot of what you would be looking for in distinguishing between a real and a fake rifle are going to be just basic signs of machine-made quality. So if you look at this screw, for example, it's not perfectly round. The slot's offset to that side, the screw's not round. This is clearly not a screw out of FN's bin of a gazillion identical machine-made screws. There are some other interesting divergences from standard factory rifles. For example, the sling swivel here is held in place by a couple of nails instead of screws. We have the same situation on the butt plate. Now, the bottom of the stock on this has chipped out. The butt plate's sort of barely held in place. This is in rough condition, but it was originally held in place by 4 nails, 2 of which are still there. And then there's 1 nail and a wood splice on the top of the rifle. Typically, you would have 1 big screw here and 1 screw in the bottom of the butt plate. It's interesting on this particular example, the floor plate, which is normally a spring-loaded button so that you can pop the floor plate open, in this case is a screw held, or not permanently in place, but held fixed in place. And if I go to take that screw out, you can see that that screw is the only thing holding against spring tension to keep that magazine floor plate in the gun. This thing is really grody inside, by the way. I tried to take the action out of the stock to see if there was anything interesting marked on it, and frankly, this rifle is pretty much held together by rust, and the stock was really tightly bound up against the barrel in the action, so I'm going to leave it in its stock. Sorry about that. Bayonet lugs are often an area that you can easily distinguish the real from the fake rifles because the bayonet lugs on these guns are often not actually properly made. Like, this will not hold a bayonet. It just looks vaguely like a bayonet lug. For comparison, here's a Yugoslav Mauser that has a standard Model 98 Mauser style bayonet lug, which the Chinese FNs would have had. So note that there's a big notch here. That's what actually locks the bayonet in place. It's got well-defined square rails here that the bayonet slides onto, and you can clearly see that our Chinese one has sort of the vague form of that, but this will not actually hold a bayonet. Another neat feature to look at here is on the front sight, and you'll see this on some of the Chinese pistols as well. There are these 2 lobes on the side of the front sight, and they're there because the real FNs look like this too. However, on the real FNs, those nubs are there because the front sight blade is actually a separate piece, and these 2 lugs are there to allow you to drift it side to side in case you need to fix the zero. Well, on the Chinese copies, they didn't realize that, or they didn't want to bother doing it, and so instead, this is all one solid block, but it's got those 2 lugs to make it look like a drift adjustable front blade. Note we've also got some pretty crude checkering here, which would initially have been there to reduce glare on the front sight. It'll do the same job here, it's just not exactly machine precise. Normally there would be a safety flag here on the back of the bolt. This particular rifle is just missing that component. It would have originally been there. We have a really loose, crude bolt stop there. And perhaps the most remarkable thing about a lot of these rifles, including this one, is that it does actually function. Who knows if it's safe? My bet would be that it is not. I'm definitely not going to be the guy who's going to take this out and try shooting it. Chances are, though, it would probably work fine, at least for a while. There is, it has locking lugs on the bolt. Their locking lug recesses machined into the receiver. I suspect the steel is of questionable alloy and probably not properly heat treated. But who knows necessarily, even if it's not well heat treated, it will probably survive at least a few rounds before the headspace really starts to stretch, and certainly before it actually explodes in your face. Not that I'm saying if you have one of these you should go shoot it. You should absolutely not. It's a really stupid idea. But when you're thinking about these in historical context, you have to consider, did the buyer of this rifle think that he was getting a fully functional, reliable piece of equipment? And the answer is yes, probably. And will it run 1,000 rounds? No, I'm sure it won't, but it'll probably work well enough to take care of the immediate needs of whoever it is bought it. The trigger mechanism does work. The striker works. It's got a nice strong spring in it. It would definitely fire. Whether the receiver would explode at some point is kind of the question. I'd like to give a big thanks to viewer Jason for loaning me this example to film for you guys. These rifles are out there in the collector market. In particular, a lot of them came into the country, well, a lot of the ones that are here, came into the country in the 1980s and 1990s. There were a lot of firearms exports from China to the US during that time period. That's where we got a lot of C96 Mausers and, frankly, a lot of the Chinese mystery pistols as well. What would often happen is a batch of actual, formal factory production guns would be exported, and stuff like this would kind of get thrown into the mix because, frankly, the people who were doing the packing and the sorting at one or both ends didn't notice, didn't care, or just didn't pay attention to the nuances and the differences between something like this and an actual FN Model 30. So they are floating around the US collector market. They've never been particularly popular, certainly not like the pistols are. Those pistols have some really interesting, unique domestic Chinese designs. Sometimes they often have interesting, goofy markings on them. The rifles don't typically have that so much. You'll have a few markings like the iffy attempt at an FN logo on this one, but the designs pretty much always just look like poorly made Mausers, and so that doesn't tend to interest a lot of people. So they're out there. If you're interested in them, a little bit of searching, I'm sure you can find one. But at any rate, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.